Hey guys, it's me, Robin, RsIslandCrafts. Today we are going to continue on our Scraps Everyone's Got Them series. I'm sorry it's taken a while to get this episode up, but Hurricane Irma, she had to come visit, whether she was welcome or not, set me back about a week and a half. But it gave you guys time to catch up and get some scraps sewn. So now I have rolls, rounds and rounds of my roll of scraps all sewn onto my calculator tape. Remember, this is non-thermal because the thermal will cause damage to your fabric in the long run, and you're better off just having straight paper if you can help it. Check down below for a link to the playlist for all these scrap series. So if you're new to the channel, welcome. And if you need to catch up, you'll be able to see everything in the list and just follow us through in order. Let's get this mess out of here now. Remember, I've talked to different people in the comments about, everyone wants to know, what can you do with these scraps? Well, scraps for me are a creative process. You can use them in any way that your imagination can go. It's a way to release ourselves so we're not having to always follow that strict pattern. Now we can take patterns and designs and incorporate this strip of scraps into it and go from there. Now back in 2011, I did a little quilt along. It was the Birdie Stitches Block of the Month by Coriander Quilts. I'll put a link to that down below also. Basically, a block of the month is every month you're given a mystery block that you usually don't know about ahead of the time, and you work along with other people online and you make that design. This one was a mixture of hand embroidery and quilting. There was 12 blocks based around a little birdie. This one's January. We were given the size of the square to begin with, and then these squares to sew around. This was 6 years ago when I was still having a hard time getting everything accurate. And as you can see, my lines didn't all line up. My squares didn't line up. Now what would have been nice is if I'd have known this technique very well then, I could have taken these fabrics still and cut them to the proper size, and if I'd have sewn them onto this strip, I would have guaranteed that they all would have been equal. Now obviously these fabrics aren't the best choice for these squares. I wanted a very bright block. Just in case you're curious, let's take a look through these blocks. January, February, March. We were using 6 strands of embroidery floss. Now, still back then, 6 years ago, I was still a little bit new to embroidery, and I had a little bit to learn there too. But these are great things to practice on. I'm thinking about doing a whole nother set of these blocks to make a different style of wall hanging. These I haven't decided. I love October pumpkins. I hadn't decided yet whether, look at the little turkey, if I wanted to make this into a quilt or to just finish off each block individually and maybe hang it up each month. I'm kind of leaning towards having a block each month. But for next time, I'll be able to take my paper and I'll be able to sew the fabric on, and then I don't have to worry about any of my blocks not lining up properly because they'll all be in strip and it'll all line up nicely. Another way to use these strips is you can make queen quilts. A queen quilt is basically rectangles of fabric sewn on top of each other, the length of, well, you can go either way, but mostly they're the length of the quilt with a panel of a solid fabric in between. So after this, you would have another fabric of your strip and then another blue. So as you can see, mine are a little bit cattywonker. They're a little crooked going down this way because when I made this strip, I wasn't sewing all my rectangles on exactly the same. I was sewing them all on different angles because I wanted a wonky strip. Now if you sewed all of your rectangles on straight, this line through the center would be nice and straight. You can either have let's say you cut all your rectangles to 3 inches wide. Then it would be equal all the way up and down. Or you can do some 3, some 2, some 1, some 5, however you want to do it. And that's a coin quilt. While we were apart and working on our own scraps, I also took the leftovers of my son's shirt and sewed a whole bunch to the paper. And I'm going to show you later on how to make a pillow. A nice fun wonky pillow. Not going to need straight seams or anything like that. It's just going to be a freeform pillow. Today I'm going to show you how to make an X block. This is where we're going to take our scrappy fabric that we had sewn to our paper, and we're going to take a square and we're going to cut it in half, and we're going to sew it to each side. I have one more left to do, and then it'll make an X. I was looking online to get the exact measurements so I could show you exactly how to do these squares and so you can do different sizes. I couldn't find a way to make it the way I wanted to show you. There was a couple different ways, but they weren't going to work for us by using our scrap strip. So I just went ahead and I cut a whole bunch of different squares of blue fabric, and I checked all my measurements, and I found out one thing. That if I cut my starting fabric at 5 inches, that my finished block would be 6 inches. I cut this one at 6.5, and my finished block was 7.5. Here's a little baby one, 3 1/4, 4 1/4. So what I figured out through this process, that if I cut my blue square fabric that I wanted to use on each side, if I cut that 1 inch smaller than what I wanted my actual square to be when it's finished, then I can go with those measurements. So the measurements I chose is I cut my blue fabric at 5.5 inch square, and then gave me a finished 6.5 inch. Okay, so what I did, since we're going to be working with a 6.5 inch square, I went ahead and cut my blue fabric at 5.5 inches. So after we have our initial square, we're going to cut it on the diagonal. Just match up the corner of your square right on the edge of your ruler, and cut it in half. Then what I did is I measured the length of the diagonal. For this one, it is almost 8 inches. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to cut my strip, I wanted it to be 1 inch longer on either side, about. There's going to be some trimming and we're going to have scraps left over, but we can always add those to our crumb quilt. It's a lot easier to start larger and trim smaller than have to start all over again because your piece wasn't long enough. So for this being an 8 inch on a diagonal, I decided I wanted a 10 inch strip. But this strip is almost 11 inches because what I had to take into consideration is if the 10 inches ended up really close to a seam, I just went ahead to the next square over. Now you can just take off of your long strip and you can just slice it right there. Or it was really easy for me to just take, I grabbed one of the seams and I just took, you can take a seam ripper, or I just took my rotary blade very carefully. I just touched it to the threads in the seam there. But I said, if that bothers you, just go ahead and take your seam ripper, lay it on its side, and just gently work through that seam. And remember, we're just dealing with scraps here. If you accidentally tear the fabric, then you'll just have to sew that onto your crumb quilt. It'll be just a smaller piece. And then just tear the fabric and use the piece you need. So that's why instead of a 10 inch strip, I have an 11. Now let me show you how I go ahead and take the paper off. This is what the back of my strip looks like. You can see where I cut off this seam from the last piece, and you get some threads. You just have to pull those out. You have to excuse my voice. It's a little scratchy today. After the storm came through, we're all having problems with our allergies. So, you can go through and you can fold each seam. Some people like to do that. They say it helps release the paper. Some people like to give both sides a nice little tug and see how easy it pops. But basically all I do is I put my thumb near the seam here because when I pull on this paper, I don't want to pull my stitching line. I don't want to stretch that thread. So just to get it started, I give it a little hold, and then just pull it off. Now when I go to pull my next piece, I give this a little tug, run my fingers around the back, whatever you need to do, and this piece will pop off. And that's as easy as it is to take the paper off. If you have a little bit that seems to get stuck, if you just take it, it usually just slides right out. If you shorten your stitching line from a 2.5 down to maybe a 2, 1.5 while you're stitching, it'll perforate the paper real easily and it pops off real simple. But for just a simple strip like this, I don't bother shortening my seam length. So now what we're going to do is we're going to be going over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew these two pieces together like that for our finished block. The best way to make sure that you don't have your square a little off and end up with a rectangle, unless you want a rectangle, now you can do that too. You just take all your pieces. You don't even have to take them to the iron. Just fold them in half, give them a little finger press. Now this, you've cut this on the bias, so be careful you don't stretch it too much. And just kind of, sort of, almost fold it in half, because, like I said, this one's a little bit longer than what I need. I tend not to use pins, because if we have our crease right here from where we folded it in half, and we folded this in half, we can match that to there. And then if you want, you can just pop a pin in. I put it over here so as I'm stitching it won't be in my way. And then after this one's sewn, we'll fold it out of the way and we'll put this one over. But let's go over to the sewing machine. Okay, I have my 2 halfway points where I folded them. I pressed them with my finger pressing. And I have those lined up. I have it straight aligned all along the edge. So then I'm just going to start sewing. I start about where this triangle meets. Some of this is going to get cut off in trimming. Now we're going to have a lot of seams that we're bumping over a lot. So go whatever speed is comfortable for you. Don't go too fast. You don't want to break a needle by accident. Then we're going to fold this out of the way. We're going to take our triangle where we have the seam folded, find our halfway point again, which is right here. You can mark your halfway with a pin. Like this one was a little bit difficult to see, so you can always put a pin at your halfway point so you know exactly where it's at. As long as we're not too far off, we can fudge it a little in our trimmings. Now once you decide on the size of block you're making, you can go ahead and chain pieces. And that's just sewing this side on one strip and then going to the next strip and sewing another triangle on, and just keep going through all your blocks. Spin them all around and then you're going to start sewing the second side. Or you can do one block at a time. It's totally up to you. It's your quilt. I am a huge fan of doing whatever works for you. As long as your quilt's going to stay together and you're getting what you need, it's not going to matter. So let's go take this over and iron it. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and set my seam. Then I'll just pull these out. I'm going to run my iron up the center to just even iron these out. I like to use steam. Helps set the seam nice. And what I'm making sure is just to make sure I don't have none of my fabrics folded into here, that I'm right at the stitching line. Press everything out nice and flat. And that's it. Now the next step is to trim it. Okay, when I trim my block, it doesn't really matter how you turn it. But what we're looking for is a 6.5 inch. I'm using my 6.5 inch square ruler, so I know as it fits on there that that's As long as there's fabric on each side, I'm within my size range. Now what you can do, if you want to have every single block perfectly exact, if you fold your strip in half, then you know to take this line. You see my line on there? This line runs down the center of your ruler. If you put this line on that crease, every block you make will be the same, because if you were to go a little this way or a little bit up higher, your X part might not match up. So I just make sure I have my center line on the center line of the fabric. Make sure I have fabric on all sides. If I have to, I don't scoot side to side. I take this center line and I scoot it up and down on that line. And that allows me to make sure that I have fabric on all four sides and four corners. You can make a little adjustment. Up here I have just a smidgen of this brown fabric on there. There, can you see better now? I went ahead and I folded my center strip in half. I aligned my yellow line on the center of the fabric, and I make sure I have blue fabric on all sides. Now I'm going to have this smidgen of brown in my seam allowance there. So what I'll try to do is I'll try to scooch it down onto this strip, this end of the strip, as much as I can. And if it's only 1/4 of an inch up there, I'll be able to pick that off, because remember, that's where our two seams, there's fabric underneath here. I'll show you. Just hold it down. I trim this side. Excuse me while I reach around you. So I have my two sides. Then I spin it around so these two sides are the ones that are cut. I put my square ruler back on. Okay, so now I've made sure I've lined up this side of the square with this side of the ruler. And I'm going to trim the extra from these two sides. So again, going to reach across you. Okay. So when you're not trying to reach over a tripod and get around everybody, you can go ahead and trim it up to whatever size square you're going. This one happens to be 6.5. And then I would just go ahead and take my squares and lay them out. So then you just lay the squares out like that and let everything match in the center. Now let me show you what I was talking about on having this little piece of extra fabric here. If we look underneath this, okay, here's the brown piece. Here's the other part of the seam. Now as long as you have a piece in the corner that matches this one you can just pick off. And there's usually just a couple stitches in there, so you can pick it off without a seam ripper. And that'll keep our 6.5 inch square still. Now you can choose to have them all the same color, all this blue, or you can change these up if you want. You can also, let's say you only want to do black and white, or you use all shades of red, or you can mix them all up. It's up to you. When it comes to a scrap quilt, for me, in my opinion, you're just taking whatever you have. So scraps are leftovers of random things. So you're just going to jam them all together. And because you put them all together, they're automatically going to go together. Now granted, you could put some ugly pieces in here, but mostly that's because you don't like the fabric. This isn't my style of fabric. This isn't something I would normally choose. I like the bright colors and the primary colors. I like all these scrappies. But when I put this into a quilt, these two fabrics are just going to get absorbed in, and I'm not even going to be able to see them. I'm going to overall just see blue with all these different colors going across it. So what they say is, if a piece of fabric is ugly to you, you haven't cut it small enough yet. Because when you cut it small enough, it disappears into the quilt and you don't notice it. So this is what I'm calling the X block. Most of the X blocks I've been seeing online is the X is made of one solid color fabric, all the same. Let's say all this pink fabric would be your X, and then maybe you can do another X in a different color, orange or something, or they would all be the same. And most of them are using white on the outside. But I kind of like how different this is, and I think when I go ahead and put my quilt together, eventually, not right away, I will use 4 blocks like this of blue, and then I would make another 4 blocks of another color. Because I like everything scrappy about it. You could just, it would look amazing just all in blue. And I might do one of those, but I don't know. I'm just kind of talking out loud right now. So for a finished quilt, you could have them, all your blocks be blue, and this would look really amazing with all the different colors going through it. Or you can go ahead and have each, this is like a 4 patch. You'd sew these 4 squares together, and that'd be 1 block. And then the next block you could have it in red, or black, or green. And then you have a very colorful quilt with all your scrap colors going through the center. You can do all red and blue, red, white, and blue, and then have white on the side. Really, it's up to you. You can do anything you want. You can take this block and just turn this into a pillow top, and then you would be done. So that's just a few of the ideas I've had for using these strips of fabric. I'd love to see what else you guys come up with. You can go ahead and tag me, RsIslandCrafts, on Instagram, and I'd love to come by and see what you've been working on. So I've shown you a couple of ideas of what you can do with these strips. Go ahead and be creative. I'm sure you can come up with a lot different things than I did. In any design quilt you're making where you're going to use a strip of fabric of whatever width, you can use this scrap technique in it. I have one more way to show you on how I plan on using these scrappy strips. I'm going to go ahead and make my son a pillow, and I'm going to take you guys along for the ride. Until then, we'll see you next time. Bye!